Hello, and welcome to this presentation entitled Bias Reporting and Evaluations. This is a talk about a pilot project undertaken by the NASM University Continuing Education and Professional Development Office. My name is Claire Cook, and I am the CPD Research Coordinator at NASM-U. Before we go any further, I want to take a minute to talk about my affiliations. I'm currently an employee of NASM-U, and in terms of financial support, this project has not received any financial or in-kind support. In continuing professional development programs, identification and mitigation of bias is a key concern to ensure the validity and trustworthiness of content. Bias is defined by the national standard as a predisposition that prevents impartiality or which promotes an unfair, limited, or prejudiced viewpoint. While originally formulated to address real and potential conflicts of interest in pharmaceutical or other industry, there is growing recognition that other forms of bias play a role in shaping content as well. One step of the process to help ensure bias is recognized and addressed when needed is a mandatory evaluation question for all accredited and certified programs that prompts participants to report any perceived bias. The wording of this question is fixed across all programs across Canada and reads, "Did you perceive any degree of bias in any part of the program?" Followed by a yes or no checkbox and a follow-up. If yes, please describe, with space for participants to comment. Literature has documented that reporting rates to this question are very low, around 1%, and that bias is often not reported, even in cases where there are clear, demonstrable examples of bias in the session. Further, many participants will simply check one of the boxes and move on, and without a description of the perceived bias, planning committees are hampered in their ability to respond to any reports of bias. Growing out of discussions with the National AFMC Research Subcommittee, and in parallel with other university CPD offices, we decided to pilot a different version of the question. The pilot included the national standards definition of bias and 3 potential types of bias, along with an other category. Participants were invited to check all that apply and to provide comments for any type of bias they identified. Participants would randomly receive either the normal question or the pilot question when filling out the program evaluation. The Lakehead REB provided an exemption from review under TCPS 2, Section 2.5. The pilot was deployed in 13 conferences certified and or accredited by the CEPD office in 2022 and 2023. 128 sessions were evaluated. On average, 92 participants attended each session with an average evaluation response rate of about 35%. We received a total of 1,878 questions to the traditional bias question and 1,824 answers to the pilot question. The rates of positive responses, meaning the participant identified bias, were essentially identical, 2.1%. However, the new format of the question allowed us to identify more sessions with multiple reports of bias, meaning that if bias was identified at all, it was twice as likely to be identified by more than one participant. In addition, for the first time, it allowed us to track reports of multiple types of bias. And using this metric, when bias was identified at all, more than one type of bias was identified almost 5% of the time. In terms of the type of bias identified, the most common type of bias was use of personal opinion rather than best practices, and we also saw many responses in the other category. To conclude, our pilot did not lead to an increased number of bias reports. However, it did allow the CEPD office and planning committees to identify the source of bias in most cases, and it allowed us to track whether sessions had multiple types of bias identified for the first time, and if so, which types. At least one planning committee would like to switch entirely to the new version of the question. And while we're waiting on changes from the CFPC before proceeding, we have integrated the randomized pilot into all of our conference and workshop evaluations. At the same time, we recognize that this is an ongoing endeavor, and with our quality improvement approach, we continue to consider how we can best identify and mitigate bias and conflicts of interest. This includes exploring whether non-industry bias should perhaps be asked as an entirely separate question, and how we can use other methods separate from evaluation to more accurately identify, especially those types of bias which may risk compromising the quality of an education program. Thank you for your interest in this topic. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.